Hello again, everybody. We're going to pick up where we left off. When we talk about communicating in friendships in terms of ending them, they generally end for at least two reasons. You start to grow to dislike the other person, so you end the friendship because, again, it's voluntary. Or the friend's life circumstances can change. Maybe they move, maybe they have a very significant shift in work and they just start to get very busy and just don't have enough time for the friendship, etc. When we talk about communicating in romantic relationships, romantic relationships differ very much so in how much they emphasize things like exclusivity. When we talk about that, it's the monogamy versus open relationships versus polygamy. In the United States, we generally go with monogamy. We do have the occasional springing up of polygamous relationships, open relationships, but culturally, there are a lot of other countries that are a lot more accepting of things like polygamy or open relationships. Another difference in terms of culture is when we talk about voluntariness. Things that would fall into this category are arranged marriage, staying in relationships for children or for religious reasons or financial reasons or simply lack of alternatives. Obviously, the United States, we don't have arranged marriage. Other cultures, that is a big thing, so that's where we would differ. And also, even co-cultural wise, staying in relationships for children or for religious reasons, that's going to vary big time for some families that maybe believe very strongly in keeping a relationship together, especially if it's a marriage. There's also love, so there's going to be differences on the emphasis of love. How important is love to a relationship and keeping a relationship versus starting a relationship and keeping a relationship for financial reasons, which both exist, both are going to be influenced by cultures and co-cultures. And there's the sexuality aspect that may differ. This is the legal recognition of same-sex marriage, and this is going to affect emphasis. Obviously, the United States, that is something that we now do prescribe to, and so culturally, we see a lot less confusion or debate over that, where in other cultures, that that's not the case. So there may be more of an emphasis on that in terms of pushing to give people equal rights. There's also the aspect of permanence. The idea of commitment to marriage permanence varies wildly across the world and, by person to person. I don't think we really need to dig into this a whole lot, but everybody treats it differently in terms of how much commitment they actually have. Excuse me. Marital types, we have 4 distinct marital types. There's traditional, separate, independent, and mixed. Breaking those down, traditional couples, we have gender typical divisions of labor, man's job, woman's job. It's a little more defined. These types of people are willing to engage in conflicts. Separate couples, somewhat similar to traditional. They still kind of have that gender typical division, but they are very autonomous. They don't necessarily function as a singular unit, and they don't generally engage in conflict either. They tend to just ignore it. And then there's independent couples. They don't believe in conventional gender roles or division of labor. They are still interdependent, which we talked about before, still that equal reliance, and they do engage in conflict. And then the final one is mixed. This is where spouses don't necessarily agree what kind of marriage they have. One may believe that they're an independent couple, where the other person believes it's a traditional couple. Romantic relationships vary a lot, excuse me, in terms of how they handle conflict. When we talk about validating couples, these couples discuss agreements very openly and cooperatively. They tend to stay more calm as they're working through those conflicts and try to diffuse the tension. Volatile couples discuss disagreements very openly, but they do it in a competitive nature. They're trying to persuade the other person as they have these disagreements. There's conflict avoiding couples, and they don't necessarily have disagreements. When they do, they discuss them very covertly rather than openly, and you see them focusing more on similarities and ultimately believing that the problems are going to resolve themselves. So then that's the reason partially that they don't engage in those discussions. And then hostile couples have frequent, intense conflict. So when they're having these discussions, there's a lot of negative emotion displays, anger, frustration, etc. And they also often engage more in personal attacks on one another. Romantic relationships vary in how they handle privacy. So there's the communication privacy management theory that exists to explain the tension between privacy and disclosure. And this goes back to one of those dialectical tensions that we talked about in the previous chapter. Um, Furthermore, partners in a couple jointly own the information about their relationship. So when you experience something with someone, you both experience it. You both have that information about the relationship. And both of those people then have the right to decide whether to share this information. But this isn't always exactly the same. One partner might think of it a little bit differently. They might be a lot more willing to share that information with their friends and family, or even publicly, like on social media, where the other person sees that as maybe even a violation. And within our relationships, we tend to form and manage privacy boundaries. So we give those expectations and those rules ahead of time, but then when things come up later on that maybe don't really work for us, then we start to manage those privacy boundaries by reinforcing, like, no, this isn't working for me, and we're going to have to adjust a little bit. Romantic relationships always also vary in how they handle emotional communication. So when we have happy partners within a relationship, they tend to share more positive emotion, less negative emotion than when there's an unhappy partnership. They also share more affection, humor, and assurances. When we talk about unhappy partners, these partners are more likely than happy partners to reciprocate expressions of negative emotion, which not really a surprise, but when we talk about instrumental communication, it's pretty clear that day-to-day tasks are going to require completion. So this is where that instrumental communication comes into play. You need to figure out, okay, who is going to take the car in to get an oil change, who's going to pick the kids up from school, etc. And the way in which partners divide everyday tasks often reflects the balance of power in their relationship. So if somebody is doing more than the other person in the relationship, you can assume that the person that's doing less is probably in the power position and forcing the other person into that submissive role and having them do more of those everyday tasks. Same-sex relationships often divide tasks more equitably than opposite-sex relationships, so we see that happen. And we're going to pause here at the family section, and I'll pick it up in the next video, okay?